Okay, so that's it. What could be easier? ForeFlight, X-Plane, an awesome simulator, and you're completely familiar with the airport that you're headed to. Wait a minute. Maybe we ought to start at the beginning. Hey everybody, this is Peter Braswell, the iPad pilot and newly minted CFI, which I'm really proud of. So I wanted to do a really short video today about something that I think every pilot has encountered at some point or another in their flying career, whether you're a student pilot or you've just earned your private pilot's license, or heck, even somebody like me who's been flying for a number of years. This scenario actually happened to me when I had to go over to a Class Charlie airport to take my initial flight instructor practical test. So the situation goes something like this. You're on your way to an unfamiliar airport. Maybe the airport is a bit more complicated than you're used to. Maybe it has a control tower. Maybe, like in this case, there's Class Charlie or Class C airspace surrounding the airport, and a complex environment once you get on the ground. You know, where do I go? Where am I headed? So in this scenario today, we're taking a really quick flight over to Richmond International. We're using two of my favorite tools, ForeFlight and X-Plane. I'll give you a little bit of a tour of my flight simulator in a second. Right now we're on short final coming into Richmond International, and the idea is we're going to brief the approach and the taxi portion of the flight, so that once we do this flight for real, we'll know where we're going and we'll have an idea of what the airport looks like. So let's head over to the iPad briefing area. We'll go over the flight really briefly, and I'll give you a lay of the land, and then we'll come back over here to actually complete this landing and actually execute what we talked about on the ground. All right, see ya. Okay, hi everybody. We're over here in the briefing room, and I want to talk really briefly about this very short trip that we've got planned from Chesterfield County Airport over to Richmond International. Now, if I haven't said already, the scenario goes something like this. You're leaving Chesterfield County on your way over to Richmond to take a check ride. This actually happened to me. I had to go over to the Richmond FSDO, the Flight Standard District Office, to take an initial CFI check ride. So the thing about flying over to Richmond International is if you look at the iPad, you can see that Richmond International is surrounded by this magenta circle. What that means is that Richmond International lies beneath Class C or Class Charlie airspace. Not a big deal, but what that means is that you've got to talk to some folks before you go blasting in there. So you want to make sure as a first step that you jot down those frequencies on your kneeboard or your ForeFlight scratch pad or whatever you use to keep track of the flight. So in this order, we're going to talk to Potomac Approach, Richmond Tower, and then once we get on the ground, we're going to talk to Richmond Ground, and they'll tell us how they want us to get to where we're going. So given that, let's pop over here to the airport diagram. This is a really handy tool for figuring out what to do once you get on the ground. And I always consult this prior to any flight to an airport that I'm not familiar, especially an airport that might be a little bit more complicated than your traditional non-towered airport. So for today's scenario, let's pretend like we're landing on runway 16. The winds are coming out of the south. And in that scenario, it's going to be likely that we're going to land, touchdown, roll out, and turn off on this taxiway Charlie to the right. Now, once we get off the runway, past the hold short line, we're going to stop and we're going to switch over to Richmond Ground when they tell us. And we're going to say, Skyline 16901 Romeo at Charlie, we'd like to taxi over to the Richmond FSDO. And then they'll come back and they'll tell us how they want us to get there. Now, the Richmond FSDO is up here where this blue dot is. So my simulation is hooked up to ForeFlight, and that's why it thinks that we're there in that little airplane on the FSDO ramp. So what they're going to do is they're going to tell us how they want us to get there. And there's really not a lot of choices, and this is really the secret to figuring out in advance how to get where you want to go. So assuming we land on runway 16, we pull off on Charlie, we're going to come up to runway 20. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you never want to go crossing an active runway unless ground gives you explicit permission to cross. So if they say something like 1691 Romeo, proceed via Charlie to uniform left on Romeo to the FSDO ramp, there's no implicit permission to cross runway 20. So in that case, what I would do is I would pull up to the hold short line at Charlie just in front of runway 20 and give a position report, tell them where I am, and just wait for permission to cross that runway. Once you get permission to cross the runway, you turn all of your aircraft lights on, the strobe, the beacon, the nav lights, the landing lights, every light you possibly can. Go ahead and turn that on, cross the active runway, and then it's a matter of just taking a right on either Alpha or Uniform, depending on what they tell us, and then motoring on up here to taxiway Romeo. And from that point on, the choices get pretty narrow. You only really have a choice to go left on Romeo and cruise on over here and wind up at the FSDO ramp. And that's really all there is to it. So the point here is it really pays to do your homework, to check out the airport and get a rough idea of the layout of the airport and where you're going to be expected to go to get to where you need to get to once you get on the ground. All right, let's head on over to the simulator and see how this all works out in practice. All right, we're back from the brief. We're on short final here to runway 16 into Richmond International. I've got different views set up of the simulation, so hopefully this will be interesting visually, and I'll talk you through the landing and what's happening once we get on the ground. So short final, runway 16, let's get this thing on the ground, and the idea is we're going to head over to the FSDO area like we briefed in the iPad briefing. Okay, so here we go. Oh, and another thing real quick, the reason I love simulators so much is because of this key right here, the P key. Things get too weird, they get too complicated, you hit P, everything stops. Don't you wish you had that in real life? All right, so here we go. All right, short final, doing 80 knots, probably a mile from the runway. I've got 1 notch of flaps, gear down, so gas on both, undercarriage, mixture prop, coming on in, looking good, nice day, no wind. Another nice thing about the simulator, you can set your own weather. So as I enter the final portion of this landing here, I kind of see the lay of the land of the airport. The taxiway I'm shooting for, I'm not going to make the Alpha turn off. I'm going to probably make the Bravo turn off, no problem. But because of the briefing that we've already done, we've kind of got an idea of where we're going and what to expect once we get on the ground. And that's the whole idea here, is know where you're going in advance, because once you get on the ground, and you start talking to ground control in the tower, things tend to happen fast and furious. Alright, so a little bit of braking action here, get this guy stopped. Alright, turned out to be a nice short field landing. How about that? Alright, so we're cruising down the runway here. At this point, the tower is probably going to either give us instructions on what taxiway to take. And it looks like we're coming up here on Charlie. I was wrong, not Bravo, it's Charlie. We're going to turn off here on Charlie. The tower is probably going to tell you to turn off here. At this point, precision and flying the aircraft properly, you want to try to stay on that yellow taxiway line. Again, just trying to be precise, and we're going to come across here, and we're going to get the aircraft all the way across this hold short line. Okay, so we're across. At this point, the tower is probably going to say something like 1691 Romeo, contact tower on 121.9 or something like that. And then once we get to the tower, or once we get over to the ground, they'll give us explicit taxi instructions on how to get where we want to go. Now in this case, we're headed over to the FSDO. We already briefed that in the pre-flight section. So I'm going to go ahead and taxi, assuming that they're going to give us Charlie and then Uniform and then Romeo on over to the FSDO. Now one thing to note here is we come up on this runway. It's, for all intents and purposes, an active runway, and we do not want to cross that runway unless ATC, ground control, has already given us permission to cross. So in this scenario, to kind of speed things up a little bit, I'm going to pretend and assume that ATC has given us clearance to cross runway 20. So we'll just go ahead and breeze right across here. If they haven't, or if they've given us explicit instructions to hold short, we would have stopped at the hold short line, waited for permission to cross the runway, and then crossed. It's really important not to assume anything. If you have any questions, that's what ATC is there for, to keep everybody safe. Ask when in doubt. Okay, so now we're on Uniform. We're going to taxi down Uniform, and if you remember in the pre-flight brief, at the end of Uniform is Romeo. We're going to take a left at the end of Uniform here onto Romeo and head on over to the FSDO. And by the way, this is the actual route that I took when I was over there at Richmond International for my initial CFI ride. And I got to be honest, I practiced in the simulator and I tried all this stuff out in advance, and it was really helpful because once I got to Richmond International, there were no surprises. I knew exactly where I was. I knew exactly what to look for. It's uncanny, the realism that X-Plane has and the ability to use a simulator like this to get yourself familiar with an airport that maybe you're not that familiar with. Alright, so we're coming up here on Romeo. We know again from the pre-flight briefing, the end of Uniform, we're going to take a left on Romeo. Again, we're assuming that the ground control has given us clearance for this route. Tower over to the left, you know, still have my bearings, and the FSDO building is actually recognizable. That's pretty much what it looks like. It's up there on the right. So we continue our taxi. And these are some FBOs and charter organizations that are dotting the sides of the taxiway here. We're coming up on the FSDO sign. Now the interesting thing is that this sign in X-Plane actually says FSDO, which I thought was pretty cool, and I was kind of surprised that once I got over to this area at Richmond International, it looked exactly like that, but instead of saying FSDO, it said ramp with an arrow over to the parking area at the FSDO. No big deal. I knew what where I was at and what I was doing, but I was kind of surprised that it didn't say FSDO. Alright, so here we are. We'll go ahead and shut down. So do a mag check. Good. Prop. Master. Avionics. Off. There you go. So that's how you use X-Plane and ForeFlight to figure out where you are at an unfamiliar airport. Alright, fly safe. Continue to learn. And if you have any problems, email me, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time. See ya.